It'll be a good week. But anyway, all right. I know we've got more people who are going to come eventually. They're just late, and that's the trend. So I don't want to start too late, though. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Whenever they come in, they can come in because the class is starting at 9:30, but it never does. So we'll just go. We'll just start now at 9:36 and get into the material. So let's go to God in prayer first before we begin. Father, we come to you at this time, thankful again for all that you do for us. You pour out so many blessings upon us, Father. This time together, the freedom to be able to meet together in your word, Father, which has been passed down through generations to us, Father, faithfully. You have made it so that way we have easy access to your word. Father, we praise you for that. We pray that we not take this for granted. We use this time to the fullest, that we focus fully on you, give ourselves fully to you in this time, Father, and then to our worship. And we look not only to be built up in this time, but more importantly, to build up others and to worship and give back to you. We praise you for all you do. We praise you for this time. We praise you for your Son. So it is in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so last week we talked about, we were getting into the plagues that are happening here in Egypt at this time. And there is obviously a reason why this is happening more than just punishing the Egyptian people. Now, we did talk about how the plagues were absolutely part of it was to punish the Egyptian people, right? Because the Egyptian people had taken advantage of the Hebrews. They had enslaved them. They had been treating them more than poorly for this time. So definitely part of the plagues was a divine justice on the Egyptian people for what they had done to the Israelites, to the Hebrew people at this point. But I think something that is important to remember is there's more to this. So we said there's another reason why the plagues were happening, but not just the plagues, but the specific plagues that God chose. And do you remember what that was in particular that I was referencing last week?
The Egyptian gods.
Right. So, again, Egypt, polytheistic, obviously meaning they worship many gods. And within their many hundreds of gods, they have a pantheon of gods that are kind of their main gods that they worship. And each one of the plagues was a direct attack on one of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped above the rest. And in this, God was going to show his power to the Egyptians and show them, hey, I understand that you believe in these gods that your fathers and forefathers have passed down to you, but these gods have no control. I have the control. And I will show this to you by doing these plagues. And so, do you remember what the first two plagues were? So, the water turns to blood, and the frogs that came afterwards, right? And we talked a little bit, and I'll kind of jump back and forth a little bit today. I have a map for Elizabeth because she's not here. So maybe I'll pull that back up later. But we have the two plagues here that we talked about last week, the water turning to blood and the frogs, and how I think especially it was very important that God chose this as the first plague because, again, as we talked about the Nile, maybe I'll go to that map now. As we talk about the Egyptian, okay, I'm not doing that. The Egyptian land, which is here, right? Here is the Nile River. Down here, over here, over here. Is it a very nice place to be?
No, it's a desert.
It's desert, right? This is called Sinai Peninsula, right? This is, again, a lot more desert. These are very not nice places to live in. This place, though, is tremendously nice. And the reason why it is tremendously nice is because of this nice little river here, the Nile River, which, as we can see here, spreads out to the Nile Delta and makes all this nice and green and beautiful as well. Very pleasant place to live. It's all based on the fact that the Nile flows out into the Mediterranean Sea, bringing itself and provides all this tremendous agricultural opportunity. When God strikes this river with blood, he is saying, I have control of the lifeline of Egypt. Everything that you have been given, I have given you because of this Nile River. And understand, I can also take it away. You do not need to put your trust in, let me pull this back here, in this God, happy, right? Because you may think that they are in control, but God assures them at this point that this God is not in control. Why? Because God has the control. Because God turns the river to blood. However, we talked about this as well last week. Did Pharaoh believe them after this happened? No. And what was the reason why Pharaoh did not believe?
Because the magicians could replicate it partially.
Right, because the magicians could do at least something similar. At least could make it conceivably believable that they could do something similar. So Pharaoh does not relent. He does not let the people go. And so they continue to have to deal with the consequences of this. And do you remember how many days the water was unsuitable to drink? 7 days. 7 days, which again, very important number in the Bible. 7 represents completion. And so after the 7 days, the judgment of the Egyptian people are complete with the first plague. But then God sends the second plague. Go ahead.
Which God was that? Did you say Hapi? H-A-P-I?
Yeah, H-A-P-I. Yes, Hapi. Hapi. So if you need to, if for reference in the future, it's going to be above the picture because I'm going to show all of them right here. Hapi.
Oh.
Egyptian god of the Nile. Yes, H-A-P-I. No, you got it. That's all right. So the next thing that happens is we see these frogs come out. And by the way, if you watch, like sometimes there has been television networks, for example, like the History Channel, who have done what they could to almost make the Bible history in a way that can kind of somewhat make sense to us. And what I mean by that is this. They will try to use natural phenomenon to try to explain what happens in the Bible. Now, do I think that that's necessarily a bad thing? Not necessarily, but they do kind of take the divine power out of the situation, right? Because they did a special on the plagues before. They've also done a special on the Exodus, them leaving and everything else like that, and the parting of the Red Sea. But they did a special on this before where they talked about how all these things could be feasible because there could have been some sort of, so the Nile turning to blood, quote unquote, wasn't actually blood. It was some kind of, I think like an algae or something like that turned the river red. Well, when it turned the river red, naturally, what did that cause the frogs and the amphibious creatures to do who were in the Nile? They then left the Nile to go find places where they weren't going to be in this fungus state. And then it became a chain reaction that caused the rest of the plagues to happen. Am I going to say that God didn't do the plagues like that? I'm not. Because I could see that God using the natural phenomenon that he created in order to do his divine will in this special way, but people don't really, but the people at the time not necessarily fully understanding like the scientific ways in which these things happen. So could that have absolutely happened? Yes. But again, I think their goal is to try to make the events of the Exodus story a lot less divine and spectacular and put them in very secular, scientific ways to diminish, I think, in some way the power of God. And so I somewhat appreciate what they do, but I somewhat also don't appreciate what they do. And, justifiably, they're not a Christian television network. And now all they talk about is like aliens and stuff. So the History Channel's gone way off the rails. But but that I can respect what they are doing, and I think that there's something good to it, while also saying, as Christians, that's not our Bible. Understanding they're talking about our Bible, it can be something interesting for us to watch, but our Bible is our Bible, right? And that's where we need to really, truly understand what's going on here. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, during all these plagues, wouldn't the Egyptians just think that their gods are angry at them? Like, they wouldn't really see it as, like, our God punishing them. They would just see it as, like, Hecate or Hapi just being mad. Because, like...
Yeah, so there is a possibility for them to have believed that if Moses wasn't very publicly also going into Egypt and publicly calling out Pharaoh at this point. Could it have just been him talking to Pharaoh directly and them not fully getting the full picture? Potentially, but a little bit of a spoiler alert. At the end of the story, the Israelite people are, right whenever they're about to leave, they are commanded by God to ask the Egyptians for wealth, for their treasures. And it seems like that's a very strange thing. But the reason for that was because they were about to leave the land. God was kind of divinely judging the Egyptians to say, we're going to take away your wealth and give it to these people who are about to leave. Some of them use that wealth not in the greatest way, but they're going to take that wealth. And the Egyptian people are very happy to give it to them. And you go, well, that's kind of strange that they would just be so happy to be like, here's all our valuables, get out of here. But the understanding in that implicitly is that they understood that the Hebrew God was the one who were doing these plagues. And so because of that, they feared the Hebrew God because of the plagues that just were committed. And that they were willing to give up all their wealth because they feared the Hebrew God. So, yes, I think maybe in some portion of this they may have believed, okay, Hecate, why have you abandoned us? Happy, why have you abandoned us? And all these different things. Why have you abandoned us? But at some point, I do think they had to recognize, oh, wait, these Hebrew people are the reason why this is happening. Because this Pharaoh, or this Moses guy keeps coming in and confronting Pharaoh about this stuff and trying to let them go. And he's using the name of his God to do this. So I do think eventually the connection was met at this point. And again, and I want to make sure that this is clear to us as well, because we think of things in a very black and white manner where these people, so we are monotheistic, we believe in one God. The Egyptians believe in many gods. So for us in our very monotheistic mindset, which I believe is the correct mindset to have, we believe there is one God. And that one God has the power, and all these other gods are false and made up. Well, if you come from a polytheistic mindset that believes there's many gods, who's to say that you couldn't just think, oh wow, that God is valid and a true God, but he is just the most powerful God among our gods, among many gods. Right? And so don't think that just because God shows his power over the Egyptian gods, that the Egyptians are then going to say, we're monotheistic and we're not going to believe any other gods. Because they're not going to do that. They may just believe, oh man, that was a very powerful God. And a lot of times as well, people in these times believed their God was very regional. And so they thought once those people left, their God left with them. Where again, we think our God goes everywhere with us, which I believe is true. They don't necessarily see it that way. Right? When the Romans would take over new territory, they would quite literally build altars to the gods of that land and bring them back to Rome to say, gods, abandon your people and be worshipped in Rome. Because they quite literally believed they could take their gods away from the people, and because quite literally there was a regionality to gods. And when you're polytheistic and you can just keep adding to the amount of gods there are, you can kind of believe those things. But again, that kind of shows a very weak God. If you can just be, taken away or could only exist in a particular region. Which, by the way, also Jonah, whenever he flees, I think that was also part of his mindset as well. As he flees the promised land of God, he can get away from the presence of God by going very, very far away. But anyway, there's a lot of things that go into this idea of polytheism and monotheism, because it's so hard for us to grasp this, because we have even if you weren't raised as a Christian, you were at least raised with mostly the mindset of if there is a God, there is a God. There's not a multitude of gods and all these different options for the gods. And so the mindset that happens, and by the way, why do the Israelites continue to struggle so much with idolatry? Is it because they keep flipping back and forth between monotheism and polytheism? Not really. It's because it was very hard for them to ever get out of their polytheistic mindset. So much of the time when they were the chosen people of God, a lot of times people held the belief that our God is the God and the most powerful God, but they didn't necessarily always believe he was the only God. And they have this issue, by the way, as soon as they leave the land of Egypt. But that's a whole separate thing. We can talk about that another time, because that will eventually be important to the story. But anyway, so the first two plagues happen. Again, the second plague happens, and does Pharaoh believe? No, he again does not believe, because the magicians are able to, in some way, shape, or form, replicate this frog plague again. Now, How do they do that? I don't necessarily know. But there is a difference, and you can read it. I don't necessarily want to go back and read all of it, but there is a marked difference in the response that Pharaoh had from the first plague to the second plague. The first plague happens, the Nile gets turned to blood. Moses says, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh's like, "No," and he also does not relent from his conviction that he shouldn't let the people go. He doesn't ask for Moses to pray on behalf of the Egyptian people to let this plague go, and the plague just kind of happens. And it goes 7 days and then it's completed. The second plague happens, the frogs come in, and they're everywhere. And Pharaoh, even though he's like, I don't want to let the people go, he's like, okay, fine, ask your God to take the frogs away, and I will let the people go. They send the frogs away, and Pharaoh's like, no, I'm good. My magicians were able to do this, so, I don't really think you really have this kind of power. But we start to see the trend of Pharaoh starting to be like, okay, fine, please tell your God to stop these things from happening. And it begins the trend because guess what? The next 7 plagues are going to be exactly that. Every time something bad's going to happen, Pharaoh's going to be like, please, for all that is good in this world, tell your God to take these things away, and I will do what he is saying to do and let the people go. And then he continues to not do the thing that he said he would do beforehand once the plague is actually over. And we're actually told eventually by God that God just hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he just was not going to believe until the will of God was fully accomplished by showing his power over the entire pantheon of gods. And so I don't want to read every single plague that exists. I encourage you in your own time of devotion and study to do that. For example, you go through from Exodus 8 on, we have the plague of gnats, then we have the plague of flies, then we have the plague of livestock dying, the plague of boils. And again, I'll kind of reference this thing that I was talking about, this History Channel documentary, because I do think it's important for us to be able to see kind of what they were thinking. Because again, so we had the river, then it turned to blood, then we have the frogs come out of the river. Well, the next thing that happens is these lice, or mites, are the dust of the earth that are coming at this point. And they are biting the people, and it is an excruciating and terrible experience for them to have at this point. Now, where did the lice come from, if you're thinking about this from a scientific way? Right, the frogs, right? The frogs that came out. This is now the gnats, are the lice that are coming off of the frogs and this territory that they're then now biting and affecting the people. Pharaoh's not very happy about it. He says, fine, tell your God to relent and I'll let the people go. He said, Moses prays to God. The lice are taken away, or the gnats, however you want to say it. I think in most modern translations it says gnats, not lice. And the gnats, we can say, come from the frogs. But what you could also say is that as the frogs die, we begin to have some insect problems, which really gets personified in the next one, which is the swarm of flies that come after, because all the frogs, they go out of the water, they die, and then we have gnats and then flies that come afterwards. So again, could that be the way that God worked things out? Potentially. It kind of makes sense from an ordered standpoint. But again, I think that more than anything, God is not only just trying to punish the Egyptians, but he's also doing these very pointedly for this reason, because we have lice that are then these lice or gnats, which are then showing the power over Geb, the Egyptian god of the earth, the dust of the earth, because we see the gnats are so plentiful, it is like the dust of the earth, and they're coming out of the dust of the earth at this point and attacking Geb. But then we have Kefri? Sure. And these swarms are at this point affecting everything to the point where it is even blocking out the sun. And we have Kefri as well, and we see this god is a creation myth god, moving the sun and rebirth. Flies were a very important part of the worship of Kefri at this point. And so again, another pointed attack on a particular Egyptian god. And by the way, if you notice, the head Kefri, it is a beetle. It is representative of an insect, and this god ends up being a god of most of the insects because he quite literally has a head of an insect. You'll notice that continual theme throughout. This one had a duck on its head, which is fantastic. But this guy was quite literally a frog, and so we have a frog, duck on the head, and then we have this gnat god, which is also had a beetle head. This is not an uncommon thing throughout the Egyptian pantheon at this point. Then we've got old Hathor, because we have this death of cattle and livestock which comes, which, by the way, again, if you're looking at this from the scientific perspective, you can understand how a bunch of gnats and flies could then spread disease onto the cattle and bite and infect them and cause their death. And so we see that potentially being an issue, but we have Hathor, love and protection, and sometimes depicted with the head of a cow, by the way. In this image, she is not, but in other situations, she is presented as having a cow's head. And the love and protection here obviously being the love and protection of the people, where the livestock, by the way, is how important in this ancient day and age. It is almost one of the most important and essential things, outside of water, probably the livestock being the most essential, because how hard is it to work fields without livestock? How hard is it to have sacrifice to gods if you don't have livestock? How hard is it to transport anything, including yourself, without livestock? And of course, livestock is also a main part of their dietary staple. So this is not an insignificant thing, the death of cattle. The death of all these cattle. Because, again, they're living in an agrarian society where they have massive fields where they need massive amounts of bovine labor in order to get properly what they need. Without that, also, by the way, lack of a source of manure as well if you don't have livestock, which also helps with the fertilization of the fields and things like that. You are losing main resources of not only work, but also of your dietary staples in general, and also your ability to be able to fully worship your gods. So this is a big deal for them to experience this. But of course, it doesn't fully end there. And we continue to see Pharaoh say, please relent. God relents. Then he doesn't give the people up at this point. And it kind of continues on. Well, now we see ashes turn to boils and sores at this point, which again, the gnats and the flies affected the livestock first, but now you've got even more death. And so you then start to see some of that infection, it seems like, potentially spread to the people. It was in the livestock, now it's in the people. And they're experiencing it. By the way, many of our worst diseases in the history of mankind have all come from animals. Has all come from animals. And so we see the death of these cows, the gnats and the flies that have happened earlier. And then we see the bovines dying, but now we have the people themselves experiencing boils and experiencing sores and tremendous discomfort, which again, one of the absolute highest gods in the Egyptian pantheon being Isis at this point, the goddess of medicine and peace, obviously being directly attacked here because they could ask their Egyptian priest however many times they want to, all the ointments or whatever they want to put on these sores, but did that heal them? No, because I do think there, again, could be some scientific background to potentially what happened in these plagues, but obviously more than anything, this is a divine punishment. And so there's not just going to be some local cream that's going to be so easy to get these things away, because this was overall, more than anything, sent to the people by God to punish them and to show his power over not only them, but this supposed Egyptian goddess, which is Isis. Now, I think something that's important to remember, we can actually, let's actually read this one a little bit. So plague number 6, which is boils, this is going to be found in chapter 9, starting in verse 8. We're going to read this really quickly. Starting in verse 8 of chapter 9. I'll just go ahead and read this whole section really quickly. We'll just make it quick this way. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handsful of soot from the kiln, and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and become boils breaking out and sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw in the air, and it became boils breaking out into sores on man and beast. And the magicians could not stand before Pharaoh because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians, upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. A couple important things with this. So number one, Moses and Aaron are doing these things in front of Pharaoh, but do you think that most of the Egyptian people would have also seen some of these actions? Well, you know what they definitely would have seen? They would have seen Moses and Aaron throwing up the soot, and then guess where it all went to? It says, where did it say that it all went to? It spread over the land of Egypt, right? It spread all over the land of Egypt. So they certainly would have at least seen that come. And then obviously whenever they're experiencing these things, then they would have made the connection at that point, right? That it wasn't just Isis that has forsaken them, but it would have been the God, the Israelite God that did this. So I think that's one important thing to remember. Another thing important to remember is this. Because we talk about who was affected. And Elizabeth, you're here now, so then I can show you this map I had. That's a really poor quality map. I'm going to try to find another one. Is that better? Sure, that looks much better. Okay, so we'll do this. So we have this nice map here. Memphis is the capital of Egypt at this time, which is here. Goshen is this area. And then we have Ramesses Zoan, which is a store city that eventually, that the Hebrews, by the way, built to store the grain during the time of who? Joseph, right? This is important. But this is the territory they live in. So as the ash is being spread over the land of Egypt, it says specifically who is affected by the boils.
The Egyptians.
The Egyptians. It specifically says the Egyptians were affected. So that leads us to believe that who wasn't affected? Right? The Hebrew people wouldn't have been affected here, right? Some of the plagues, I do feel like the Israelite people had to experience in some way, because it's very hard for me to believe that the Nile River here, especially at Memphis, the capital, would have turned to blood, and them upstream would not have felt it. Right? Yes. He can't do anything, right? He could do anything, but I think they may have been slightly affected. But again, that was a plague that was kind of a warning shot more than anything, because did it seem like many people died from that? No, because they were able to then dig wells near the Nile and get water. But it was, I think, that first plague, I think, was a statement by God to say, this most powerful resource that you have, that is the source of all of your power, I have complete and full control over. So understand that from the very beginning. But as time goes along, I don't think that the people here in Goshen experienced the plagues. They would have seen the Egyptians do it, experience them. But they themselves wouldn't have had to deal with them. Which again lends to the idea, did the people of Egypt know that these things were happening to them on account of the Hebrew God? Well, I think more evidence would say yes, because they saw the people of the Hebrews say, oh, we're good over here. And they go, how are you good and we're not? Why? Because the plagues weren't meant for them. They were meant for the Egyptians at this point, because of what they did to the Hebrews and to the Hebrews in their land. You have another question?
I was going to ask if there was a plague for Set, their god of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking that might be a little bit more
Let me look here.
counterintuitive.
We're eventually going to go in here. So we have Nut, Seth. There you go. Storms of disorder. So we've got locusts that are sent from the skies at this point. So we've got, you talking about Seth or Set? Are they different?
Set.
Are they different? Okay, hold on. We have Ra, and we have Pharaoh himself. I guess not at this point, or maybe that is. No, that's the storm and disorder god. So maybe not Set at this point, at least not that I've seen. So potentially not.
Because I felt like that'd be counterintuitive, because he was the god of destruction.
Yes.
So I feel like
that may have been counterintuitive, but maybe that's why God didn't send a plague with Sets to attack Set. I guess because to the god to show his power of the god of destruction, he'd have to create. Right? Yeah. I guess that's the way it worked. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting idea. Yeah. So that's a good question. So we've got here at this point, we've had Isis with the boils. The next thing that happens is hail that rains down in the form of fire at this point, which obviously this is a big deal, not only from the destructiveness of the hail itself, but also what all it kills, not only some people, but some livestock and property and things like this that happens, again attacking one of the gods, Nut. At this point, one of the Egyptian gods of the sky, showing the power over that.
How's there any livestock with that?
I know that's a great question, right? I mean, maybe they were able to hide some in barns at this point. Some were able to get through the initial. But you notice they keep reducing the livestock, right? So we went from the death of the livestock here to then boils and sores, which, by the way, did the boils and sores just affect the people? No, it said affected the animals as well. And then kind of the finisher on this was the hail that got sent and killed the rest of the livestock, it seemed like. So at this point, I'm assuming there probably is not much livestock at all left in Egypt after this third and final plague that affected the livestock directly. Well, then, of course, Elizabeth, you have a question?
I was just Googling God versus Set, S-E-T, is that what we're talking about? And it said he was the protector of crops, and the locusts were the ones that. Did we do that?
So, well, maybe that's where this person is saying Seth instead of Set. So maybe Seth is an anglicized version of Set, so that way we can read it a little bit better. But there you go. So there you go. So that's that Seth and Set, I guess, connect with each other.
They're like invasive, so that's pretty.
Yes.
If he's a god of disorder and destruction, that's pretty.
Well, and especially in this way with the locust being sent, because again, I think something that's important for us to remember is, so the wealth in Egypt is all based off, really more than anything, their agricultural standing. And so the first things that get attacked, really from this standpoint, not only was it the Nile, which is the bringer of most of the water and the resources they need for their crops, but then beyond that, then the livestock take a huge hit throughout multiple plagues. Well, the last thing that's really left standing for them is the crops that are already existing in the fields, right? And in the stores and the granaries and things like that. Well, what happens then? Well, God then sends locusts to do that exact job and take care of the last kind of remnant of the what make them powerful, which is, okay, you've taken away their livestock, the ability to be able to do these things. You've affected the waters of the Nile to be able to get the resources they need for that. Well, now the plants that are already in the field are going to be destroyed by these locusts. And so the power of Egypt has effectively been completely reduced in a matter of, a month by all these different things. While also, by the way, God again subsequently showing his power over the Egyptian pantheon at the same time. While also judging the people of Israel, the people of Egypt for their wrongdoing, for the people of Israel. So, there's more to these plagues than just this really stinks. God does things on multiple levels. And we see this in the plagues. And so we see that again with the locust. And the last two plagues are going to affect really the most important gods within the Egyptian pantheon, because then we see 3 days of complete darkness that come after that. And I'm not necessarily as well versed on the Egyptian gods as I am Greco-Roman mythology, but Ra, very important god, right? What you going to say?
I was going to say that Ra is actually a combination of three gods. You have Khepri, which is actually a scarab. Because Ra's trip, he goes through the underworld in the ship, and he lights the sun, and he would emerge the next day as the next phase. And he was the pharaoh until he was removed from office by Isis and Horus.
There you go. So very interesting. So we have Ra here, a very important deity. Obviously, is the sun important to the Egyptians? Only a lot, right? Because again, so in order to grow plants, you need the sun, you need water, you need land, and you need the animals to be able to till the soil and produce some fertilizer, right? Did God in some way, shape, or form affect all of that? in one way or another? Absolutely. Here, right? And the final one was the sun. And by the way, if you want to show power in the most noticeable way possible, I think, is there anything that is not God that is more powerful, that produces more power, that is a symbol of power more than the sun? It's much larger than us. It's constantly producing tons of energy and light. In fact, really all energy on Earth, in effect, comes from the sun, because the sun shines down on the earth and it produces energy in the plants that then produce energy in the animals that then produce energy in us who eat the plants and animals. And so all of the energy effectively on earth comes from the sun. And they understand these things, not really. But the sun is also a giant symbol of power every single day that you see and you can count on. You know that a day is a day based on the rotation of the what? The earth around the sun, right? The earth around the sun. So you know that for it to be the case. You can count on the sun showing up every single day. How scared would you be if one morning you woke up and the sun wasn't there? And then you went to sleep after what you think is the worst day ever in history, and it happens again. You would be very scared at this point, right? And then finally it happens a third time. Now, how was this done? This is also where the documentary that I mentioned on the channel would say some of the previous plagues that would have occurred would have created so much of a dust cloud that it would have been almost like there would have been a break in the sun for all these sorts of things. I don't know exactly how God was able to turn off the sun in a particular location, nor am I supposed to know such things, I think. But understanding that God was able to distort these things in such a way in which they had complete darkness over the land for a full 3-day period to show the final, it's actually the penultimate, it's not the ultimate, it's the penultimate showing of his power to the people by being able to turn off the light and effectively show his power over one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon, which is Ra, the sun god. Very important stuff. But the final plague, and I'll lightly touch on this before we leave. The final plague was, of course, the plague that hit at the most present god of the pantheon to them, which was Pharaoh himself. Because again, they believed that Pharaoh was just another man. No, they believed him to be an incarnation of a god, of a deity, of Horus, right? And so because of this, Pharaoh stood as the kind of ultimate symbol of the God's power and presence on earth within man. And the final plague is going to affect not only the Egyptian firstborn, but finally Pharaoh himself. Because Pharaoh, while he's in his palace, did he experience many of these plagues? I think he does. But there's one that he felt the most acutely, because he lost his firstborn son to the final plague. And this, of course, is a huge moment, because it is finally the plague that proverbially broke the camel's back at this point. Because at this point, Pharaoh gives in and lets the people go. But not after God had had the opportunity to show his power over all the Egyptian gods, including all the major Egyptian gods, including Pharaoh himself. So, lessons to be taken away from this could be a few. Number one is maybe, do what God says the first time and stop ignoring all his clear signs to you. That'd be one. Number two, don't get on the wrong side of God, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of God. But finally, I think we see that our God is an awesome God and a powerful God. And we can put a lot of things on pedestals within this earth and put a lot of things as most important. But at the end of the day, anything here on earth has been given to us by God in the first place, right? The Egyptians are the most powerful kingdom in the world at this time because of their own efforts, or because of the God who gave them the Nile River and gave them the sun that helps them grow the crops in the Nile River and gives them the silt that comes from the Nile River that fertilizes their crops and gives them the livestock to be able to then work the fields and do those sorts of things. That's what makes them the most powerful kingdom in the world, is because of what God gave them. And at any time could God take that away? Well, he showed that. Well, I think the same could be said for us. You guys know that there is a very clear turning in pretty much any religious affiliation when countries get to a certain amount of wealth. As in, when the people of a country become wealthy enough, there's a marked decrease in practicing of religion. Why do you think that's the case?
Because of science.
Because of science. So explain that a little bit further. So you think because they have wealth, they're able to then do more scientific exploration, you feel like? Is that what you're saying?
Because it was shown in Europe after World War II, the countries that the Soviet Union occupied, and Iron Curtain, all of them are, you can look at the statistics, all of them are mostly Catholic still today. But you look at Western Europe, which the United States liberated, almost all of them are completely atheists or have like no state religion. And I saw online that in the Soviet occupied countries, people would protest the atheism of the state, which the Soviet Union was atheist, by like having like secret communities where like, they would dance, they would sing, and they would express themselves as like Christian, because they saw Christianity as like an escape from the Soviet Union. But in the West, the United States gave them the Marshall Plan, which was like free money to rebuild the country, and they didn't view religion this way. They just viewed it as like a secondary thought compared to like growth and prosperity. So you can look at like a cushy life versus like a life of like suffering.
So I'll emphasize this. So I think you're on track for what the point I'm trying to make at this point. So I think you're kind of on track for this. It's this, I'd say, at the end of the day. When you have wealth and you feel like you can take care of yourself, do you believe that you need anybody else to help you take care of yourself? No, you feel that you are self-sufficient in this way, right? Where I think, and to your point, when you have countries that were extremely prosperous, their GDPs went through the roof, they became a middle class, they became a wealthy middle class, did those people then feel like they needed a God? No.
We got to think about the Middle East, and we got to think about regions of Africa that became wealthy and still had religion in there, but that is more authoritarian religion.
Yeah.
I would say.
Well, I would also say, depending on what you mean by wealthy, because what I define as a country's wealth is what is the strength of the middle class, right? Because that's the majority, the lower end portion of the country as compared to the middle class portion of the country. That's where the majority of your population is, between lower and middle class. In America, our biggest segment is the middle class. And so we have a wealthy middle class, and because we have a wealthy middle class, a lot of people are starting to believe that they no longer need a God to take care of them at this point. Whereas if you're talking about like certain places in Africa that maybe have a very wealthy upper class, they would not. That's kind of a different situation, because there certainly people who have some wealth in countries that have certain resources that they're exporting. Absolutely.
Yeah, in those countries, I would also say that the wealth gap is huge.
Correct. And that's more what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily the country's GDP, more about the wealth of the individual, right? Because as we've seen in Western countries, as well as we've seen in different places, the more wealthy a person becomes, the less they feel they are dependent and needing God. Whereas, and that's where the church is dying a lot of times in the West, both in Europe and in North America. But the places where the church is growing the most, where the most people are being baptized and saved, are sub-Saharan Africa and in India, especially, places where the wealth gap is quite large, where there's a very large group of people within poverty, and they are looking for somebody to give them what they need, and they look towards God, and they see that. So there's something to be said for, it's great to have blessings here on earth and be blessed, but in that we must always make sure, regardless of our situations, that we are understanding who is the one who gives it to us. Because the Egyptians had all these wonderful things, and they gave credit to their gods or to themselves. when really it was God who had given them those things, and God could very quickly take it away. And this is important for us, I think, in modern day America, because I understand the financial situation isn't tremendous always in America as it maybe was ever so many years ago, or blah, blah. I don't want to get into that. But we are still extremely wealthy, the wealthiest country pretty much in the history of the world. We are incredibly wealthy. Our middle class is still incredibly strong in this country. And because of that, we are a lot of times losing our faith, because we're looking to be self-sufficient and not look to give ourselves to God. And that's where I think it's important for us to be able to remember who gives us all things. Well, it's God. And who can take it away at a blink of an eye? God. So we must love God, appreciate God, and also fear Him as well. So let me say a quick prayer, and then we can let y'all go. Heavenly Father, we, again, thank you for all the blessings you pour out upon us. We are such a blessed people, Father. Help us to always remember it is from you that we receive all these blessings. And it is at your name that we give praise and worship, Father, and that we give ourselves fully to you at this time of worship, and as well as when we leave here, Father, that we be missionaries in your field, Father, that we tell others about all the blessings that you pour out, and we help others to be able to come to know you, Father, for there is no greater blessing that we could give to somebody else than to tell them about you. Help us to do this, Father, now and always. In your Son's name I pray. Amen. All right, thank you all.